these devices.
Okay.
Okay.
China is suffering some very serious environment problem
Yes.
now, and people are realized that we have already learned the lesson from that. We didn't, take care of our natural capital. So I think natural capital is a very important idea for Chinese to learn.
Yes, yes.
So, but it's very difficult to measure. So how can we count it into our system? Because just as this morning, Dali said, the economic didn't take account of
Our natural
environment.
assets,
Yeah.
yes.
The natural resources, natural capital.
Yeah.
But how can we count it? Do you have any?
So, I was advisor to China between 2003 and 2007 on China's green GDP initiative. Hu Jintao and that. So we have the recommendation from the Central Planning Committee to adopt these ideas of ecological civilization, circular economy. Now, one thing, so when I was invited in 2003, I was invited to talk about natural capital accounting and the experience internationally of green GDP. And what I said is the countries that were earliest adopters of the idea of natural capital accounting were Canada and Norway. But those countries, my country included, hasn't adopted these practices for the purpose of economic planning. So now China at least made some progress in establishing a green GDP that counted pollution costs, and I believe it was something like 3% of China's GDP was just pollution costs. Now, that's just pollution. Now, what I would argue in any case for China or any country is that it has to...
Oh, this is my son.
Oh, that's nice.
He's trying to help us to raise funds.
You're going to help us?
This is what I made and my colleagues designed and printed. So he's trying, because we do an exhibit and we found very lost and a lot of money that we cannot afford. So we made some bags.
Oh, that's nice. So the first order of business would be to establish a balance sheet of natural assets for China. That would include how much arable land you have, your rivers, air, the quality of air, the different landscapes. So from wetlands to forests once that inventory has been done, we would establish how healthy those natural assets are.
But the value of natural may be very difficult
Not value initially, just physical inventory. Just what's the quality of our natural environment? What's the health of the forest, the agricultural land, the Yangtze River, and a proper accounting of that would show that where natural assets are healthy or at risk, right? So this accounting system, but the truth is no nations account for natural assets because no nations have balance sheets. A balance sheet is, what's typically used with companies to look at assets, liabilities, and equity, so distribution of well-being. So a natural asset balance sheet for China would establish an accounting of the entire land base, right? And as well as accounting for the liabilities, the risks to ecological health that are associated with, of course, the economy, right? So that's a big step, though, because, as I said, no nations have a balance sheet, and this is not the economic model that is used in the World Trade Organization or any international organizations. So once the natural capital balance sheet is established, then China can make decisions about how much of the productivity of the land it can use to create a sustainable economy, right? And how much it will have to import. So of course it will have to import certain materials, energy, oil and gas.
I like your idea, the solar energy as pure income.
Yeah. Now, so I see China making, now I know and that, you use way too much coal You have
Yeah.
lots of coal. You have more coal than most countries.
But our coal is occupied 2/3 of the all the
Yeah.
energy consumption. Oh, by the way, later maybe after our call, I'll get you a booklet. Inside we put a China Ecological Civilization annual report. Maybe there's some statistics that you may think
Yes.
useful to you.
So I would say that, as with all citizens, all Chinese citizens should have an honest accounting. Now, for me, I'm hopeful because having worked on the Xiaokang indicators for Chinese municipalities, that because of your centralized planning system, you still have the ability to mobilize these ideas on a national scale. I also understand that certain regions in China will feel that they will be hard done by because the regions which have more resource extraction, therefore more pollution, versus Shanghai are, we don't want to penalize them either. So we want to have an honest accounting across the whole nation and say, well, how did the different regions now exchange natural assets? The resource-rich regions are going to supply coal to fuel Shanghai's electricity. But the other opportunities, and of course, are to invest some of that huge GDP growth in the renewable energy capacity of China, which I think China is doing. You have the biggest, I think, wind capacity now in the world, right? And you could quickly move to a solar economy, I think, very rapidly, like Germany has. Like Germany did it in 15 years. So China, I have great hope in China that, yes, environmental conditions are terrible. There's unnecessary human suffering because of pollution. And I would also argue that China could, one thing I observed is, in principle, China could decide, in a sense, to close its borders. In other words, it doesn't have to produce anymore for Walmart. And when I studied your economic policies, from going back to Deng Xiaoping, that if Xiaokang meant $4,000 US per capita GDP, you've already achieved that and more. Now the problem is you're forcing farmers, the stewards of the land, to come into the cities. Well, that doesn't make sense. We have to find a way of keeping the farmers on the land and earning a sufficient income to have a good life, right, and produce healthy and good food. So, all of those things I observe as in terms of strategy for China.
And I think because in the 1960s, 1970s, such as in Los Angeles, there was very serious smog. And the pollution make many people, including John Cobb and some others, they realize that the environment is so important. I think it's including Herman Daly and many others. And then the Western country, when they are trying to avoid the pollution, they move the manufacture to China, to India and other developing
externalized,
countries.
Right?
Externalized. But for China and India and some other developing countries, they have nowhere to move the manufacture.
That's right. Yeah, there's nowhere else to move to.
Yeah, so I agree with you that China, if we want to deal with the pollution, we cannot produce so much things for earning money. Maybe we just meet our needs, and then every country meet their needs.
Yeah, well, this is my hope for China. So on the monetary side, if China, as Ellen Brown says, has adopted Abraham Lincoln's idea of centralized monetary policy to create enough money for China's needs without the dependency on private banks to create the money, then China is in complete control of its economic destiny, unlike any other nation right now. So China could decide to pursue a circular economy, right, a harmonious development, by strategically creating the liquidity. Instead of empty office towers in Shanghai, you start directing it to actually, the conditions lead to the circular economy being achieved, right? Of course, you and I know that I was just in Harbin teaching, students at HIT, and young people aspire to all the material things that the West has, right? And when you're 20 years old, of course you want a Land Rover, because that's what a success looks like. So we have to recognize that I think in human beings there is this kind of characteristics of greed of materialism, of desire for a good life. But then the question is, how do as society we return back to the ancient traditions and teachings of Taoism and Buddhism, right? Of harmony. And in China, I think in your 5,000 years of history, you are teachers of Lao Tzu. You know, he gave us all the teachings, but of course they didn't really accept his teaching the whole time either. But I look at that and go like, so that's what encourages me. It's like it's not that Mao got it wrong in any way, but you know, let's not. My message to China is don't forget your traditions of Confucianism, Taoism, and right, Buddhism that are still alive in China's spirit, right? So how do you now attach your economic policy when you had the Emperor Qianlong, you know, send the British away when they wanted to free trade in 1795, and what did they start? The Opium War with the Qing dynasty, right? Which led to the collapse of the Qing dynasty. So it's like, so we can tell that story, and you know.
And because China is now purposely slower down the economic growth, and a lot of factories are now closing because
Really?
yeah, a lot of factories because first some of them because pollution don't want to make so much pollution, and the second because we don't want to cost so much, including the natural capital and the human resources, a lot of other costs to produce things to export. So we are turning, but on the turn, because a lot of people are suffering unemployment. Before, when we trying to make a lot of goods, a lot of people coming to the city from villages. They abandoned their land.
That's right.
And then they became a city immigrant. But now the factory closed and they
can't go back to the land.
So do you think they should go back to the land, and maybe because some scholars said there will be a revolution on agriculture?
There will,
You believe so?
Yes, of course. So look at your history. When do revolutions occur, right? I mean, you have to take care of the land. You have to encourage those land stewards to come back to the land. And I think one of the lessons China could learn from the West, in particular Israel and the ancient, is property. So, you know, I think we're more motivated to be good stewards of our little piece of land, and that's something I think China, you know, doesn't have experience with. But somehow there's a great truth and mystery in that. So, you know, working for the well-being of the land base, but still recognizing that some form of private property, maybe that's not the exact right word, is also a way to think about, you know, the strategy for. And I think if we encouraged the farmers, I mean, the fact that they can't go back, or they don't feel they can go back, or they don't feel they can't make enough money to pay for the life that they had in Beijing or Shanghai. So we have to, and money itself is a mental block. We could pay the farmers $20 an hour to grow good food. Of course, we'll pay more for it.
So
but see, it's a mindset.
As an economist, do you agree they're talking that the current modern industrial farming, it's not sustainable?
No, it's not sustainable.
So
it's artificial. It's totally like what Vandana's talking about, right?
You agree with her?
Well, nature shows that when we do good farming, land, soil stewardship, we get more productivity. Nature is abundant. When we think it's just an empty vessel and we put fertilizer, the statistics might show greater yields, but eventually you get a collapse because the soil's exhausted. It's gray. You look at California, you get gray soil because it has no life. So, but if it's true that you actually eventually get greater yields, greater productivity. I was just reading a story about Matsumoto, a Japanese born, well, maybe third generation, in California, growing peaches in this drought. And he's saying, I wouldn't have believed it, but the peaches I'm growing now are amazing. They're more flavorful than anything I've ever... And we know this from growing grapes. Like, the less water, sometimes the richer the taste of the grape, the sweeter the wine, right? So it's like... And he's like, well, maybe all my model would said put more water so you get bigger peaches because people want big peaches, but it has no flavor. So I'd rather maybe eat a smaller peach, and I bite into it, I'm like, wow, this is a peach.
Yeah. So how about the genetic modified food in Canada? Can
Oh,
I
think it's crazy.
It's crazy.
It's arrogant. It's arrogant. It's arrogant to believe that you can, that for me, like as a Christian, God gave us all of this. This is all a gift, right? To say that I now have property rights over seeds, right? That I control, through a corporate license.
How about the situation? Because I've never been to Canada, so I don't know. Is there a labeling law? I mean, law that force?
No, we don't.
You don't.
No,
Just like
we still
the
produce
US.
GMO canola. A lot of Monsanto's seeds are used.
Here, about 80% of the processed food contain GMO integrant.
Yeah. So as Vandana says, it's actually destroying our gut. Maybe it's leading to autism. Like, that's crazy. That's stupid and monstrous.
How about in Canada? Same kind of situation.
Sure, of course.
How about because in the U.S. The sugar beets, canola,
Corn.
soybean,
Look at corn. It's all GMO.
And corns.
Yeah.
About 90% of them are GMO.
Yeah.
So in Canada, the same situation.
Yeah. Are you going?
We're going, and then we're not. We have tomorrow. We have flight in the morning, so
We got Monday
we're
coming
not
up
back
next.
tomorrow.
All right.
So you keep at that session. Keep it going.
Thanks.
All
We'll
right.
talk
Nice
about
meeting you.
too.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
See you.
All right.
Okay. See you
Great
soon.
getting
We'll
to
keep
have some time together.
writing.
So how about the consumers? Because in the U.S. now, environmentalists and consumer groups are strongly opposed to GMO food and GMO industry. So how about in Canada? The same?
There's opposition. There's, there was the demand to label food in the grocery stores GMO or non-GMO, right? But the industry fought that, has been fighting it because, of course, I think if consumers saw a GMO label, they might not choose to buy it, right? But if you don't know, you're buying, Dorito corn chips, and it's that big sticker, warning GMO on it. It's like on cigarettes. Then you might say, if you knew that it's actually destroying your gut, right? Then you'd make different choices. But again, it's the incredible power of these corporations, and they're so arrogant.
So are there many people buying organic in Canada?
Lots of people buying at farmers markets, more and more farmer markets. So we're voting with our feet. We're going to shake the hand of the person who produced the food. Now, they're also not getting paid enough, right? I know that because they're kind of a working poor, but they're producing good food, and we go and support them. Right? Yeah. So we see more and more farmers markets, which is good. And I would say some of the grocery stores are supporting more local produce, which is good. So that wave is I would say increasing. Yeah. And maybe eventually the GMO thing will, I hope, like one day it'll be like cigarettes. They'll say, this was stupid. Monsanto was, they were a bad corporate citizen. They believed in their science. Of course, a lot of good people work in the company. They believe that they're doing good for the hunger of the world.
Man, do you believe that this kind of monopoly, the economy that's controlled by the large corporations will be over someday? How it will end?
Well, I think it ends when we walk away from them. Right? We choose to vote with our dollar. We consume based on our preferences. So, but we can't make those decisions unless there's a full and honest accounting of the how the food is produced, who produces it, and on what conditions. Right? So I think I could choose not to drink. I know that Coca-Cola, if a can of Coke sat in your stomach for 3 days, your stomach would be destroyed, right? And so why would I drink Coke? Like, how can Coke feel like it's producing a beverage that is actually good for you? Because it's not good for you. So, but I think people have to vote with their conscience, but they also have to, I think there's a requirement on governments to impose on companies to report on the full content of food, right? Which in the U.S. at least, you have nutritional value and all that broken down. But if it said 80% of the content is GMO based, all that might change people's decisions, right? I mean, the sad thing is that we have to pay more for non-GMO, for so-called organic, right? And those farmers have to spend a lot of money to certify.
Yeah.
When
So how much
probably
they-
50 years ago, like my grandparents were farming, they were like organic. That was normal.
Yeah. Every
In
day
China
we
too,
heard-
right? India's like, what? That's not organic. I don't have to certify something that, if I have pigs, I have manure. I was like, I don't need fertilizer. It's all here. So within 2-3 generations, we have become sort of, yeah.
So I've long been looking forward to meet you and talk about how to say, this kind of ecological, economic views. So
Yeah.
can I have your email address?
Yes.
So someday if I need to get some...
Yeah, I'll write it down for you.
You mean the